This is the Observations Podcast for Sunday, the something or other of April, the 16th of April, 2023. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm Dale Franks. As always, it's a pleasure to bring the podcast to you. I am once again flying solo. Michael and his family have been out here in San Diego for the past week for work. And in fact, yesterday I was able to get together with Michael and have a lunch down in San Diego. We had a good time. Also met his daughter, who he brought with him yesterday. And she's very precocious and just cute as a bug. And so we had a nice dinner, but today they are flying back to Virginia. So they left this morning at about 10 o'clock, and so they should be arriving in Virginia, I guess, just about now. They had a layover, I suppose, in L.A. So next week, Michael will probably be back, and we will be back to having conversations rather than just me having a rant. Last week worked out well because I had a lot of source content to go through, and we had one major subject that I wanted to talk about. And excuse me while I have a refreshing beverage. Today, I got a couple of different things that I want to talk about, and we'll get to them. And the first thing I want to talk about was prompted by seeing this. This is a tweet by Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, who posted this little cartoon. And it shows Russia in red, also marked not America. Ukraine in blue, also not America. And with a parenthetical pin in that map saying not our border. And all of the other countries, not America, no, not our concern, also not, etc., etc., etc. It's this, I guess you could call it the rise of a new American isolationism. And isolationism, if you remember from your junior high and high school civics classes, assume that you actually had civics classes, let's say history classes. I'm sure you had history classes. I don't know what you were taught, but I was taught that America was traditionally an isolationist country, and we didn't want to get involved with all of the shenanigans that used to go on in Europe all the time. And in fact, kept going on in Europe until 1945. We had two big interruptions to our isolationism, one in 1917, with World War I, and one on December 7, 1941, with World War II. After World War II, it was us and the Soviet Union, and we kind of tried to slide back into isolationism, 1946, 1947, and then the Russians made it necessary, in the view of the United States government, to become much more internationalist than we had been. And one of the lessons that we learned about isolationism, or that we thought we had learned in the 1930s, was that if you're an isolationist, well, the world's become a much smaller place. And so players like, at the time, Germany and Japan, now, you might want to be isolationist, but they don't appear to want to be, and they will punish you if you are isolationist. Although, for the most part, Japan did the punishing of us, not Germany. Germany did not have the same sort of strategic power projection capability that Japan had in the 1930s and 1940s. In any event, after World War II, we became a non-isolationist country. We became, as the famous saying goes, the world's policeman. And the justification for that was the existence of a bipolar world. The Soviet Union on one side, and the Eastern Bloc countries, and China, the expansion of communism throughout the world, throughout the 1950s and 1960s. And so it seemed like we needed to be an active participant in world affairs. The problem is that Americans don't do things by half measures. And I'm getting I'm getting a message that says you're getting feedback. I don't know what getting feedback means. So I don't know if you're getting. I don't know if it is an artifact of. Okay. Now it's really interrupted me. I don't know what getting feedback means. So I don't know if you're hearing echoes or if you're hearing a feedback whine or what it is that you might be hearing from the sound. So if we have bad sound quality, we may have to shut this thing down. Here's what happened today. So if we can go back to isolationism, we will. Unfortunately, from my point of view, the sound sounds fine, so I don't know why you're hearing bad sound. And I don't know why you're getting feedback. So I could probably mess with the sound a little bit. But I think if I do that, so you say you're getting an echo. See, I don't know if that's me or if that is coming out of the stream. So we may be getting bad audio from the stream. So let's see. Let's turn this off. Let's disable that. Okay. And now we have no sound. So we have to fix the sound problems. I'm not sure what the sound problems are. So now we have no sound. Shoot. Okay, well, now I've got sound coming from camera. Okay, do we still have sound? Or do we have an echo? Let me type in chat, still have sound or an echo. So what happened today was, okay, she says that's better. All right, so I must have had something going on that didn't need to go on. So sorry about that. I've been having computer problems today. First of all, my USB keyboard went Tango Uniform on me earlier while I was working, and I had to find a Razer gaming keyboard that is technically a Bluetooth keyboard for Xbox, but also has a USB connection. I managed to install it on my computer so I could actually have a keyboard. So I've had to order a keyboard from Amazon to get here tomorrow so that I can fix that. In any case, then I had a problem with my USB hub, and I had to replug everything into different USB ports directly into my computer, which saw them as new devices and which has now screwed up everything. And so I spent an hour prior to the podcast trying to fix everything. I guess I didn't. So I guess I messed things up there. That means that my beginning is going to be, it's going to be awful. So I apologize for that. Apologize for the bad sound. You know what I'm inclined to do is just restart the whole thing over. But you know what? We're just going to have to live with it as it is. And get back to this. Where were we? This idea of isolationism. So, as I was about to say, here's the problem with this country. We don't do things by half measures. When we are isolationist, we are fully isolationist. And that little cartoon by Marjorie Taylor Greene, which I should probably bring back up here, that is probably a perfect example of what it is. All of these countries are heathen foreigners, and so therefore they're not our concern. And so therefore, presumably, the idea is that we shouldn't really do anything for them. Their problems are their own. They don't bother us. Well, 1941 should have taught us that that is not entirely true. The problem is 2001 through 2022 or 2021, we took that lesson of we can't be isolationist anymore. We do have interests. We are, for better or for worse, a global power. Our interests are global and our enemies are global. And we have to exercise American power overseas many times to secure our interests, something that we never did prior to 1939, really. I mean, it's hard for Americans to, or 1941. It's hard to remember that in 1939, the American army was 100,000 people. We had an army smaller than the nation of Romania. So we weren't exercising a lot of power. Now, we did have some power projection because we did have 4 or 5 aircraft carriers, 5 or 6 actually, at the end of the 1930s. We had a relatively large Navy, but our Army was 100,000 people, most of whom were in their 30s and 40s. I mean, if you were a lieutenant commissioned in 1925, by 1939, you would have been lucky to be a captain. You were probably still a first lieutenant. We had a lot of generals who were in their 60s and older, who had been in the Army since 1900. So the American Army was not set up to be an expeditionary force. We had to create that Army in 1939. That was a isolationist army. We don't really need an army. What we really need is a cadre. So in case we're invaded, we can call up the National Guard, and then we can recognize some state militias, and we can all organize and fight whenever we're invaded. But besides, who's going to invade us? One of the reasons why we have a large Navy and a small army is the large Navy will keep people from invading us. Also, an armed citizenry kind of helps in that respect as well. Well, that's not the world that we live in. We lived in a world of internationalism after the Second World War. But back to Americans not doing things by half measures. We can't find a middle ground. Oh, okay. So after September 11th, 2001, well, what we really needed to do was invade Afghanistan and then invade Iraq and stay in Iraq for 10 years and Afghanistan for 20, without an actual end goal or end state or objective in mind that would tell us when we had won in Afghanistan. And what we ended up with is this endless wars in the Middle East. And we've really been fighting in various countries since the 1990s, really since the Gulf War. Okay, it's one thing to not be isolationist and to be internationalist. It's another thing to be sending American troops to, let's say, the Persian Gulf, then Kosovo, Somalia. We can't forget about that one. Then back to the Persian Gulf, back into Iraq, back into Afghanistan. Basically constant warfare since 1991. And the big dig on the neoconservatives, the neocons as they call them, was that that's really all they knew how to do. You've done something that the American government doesn't like, so it's time for us to send the military in to attack you. Okay, well, obviously that's not internationalist either. It's not isolationist, but it's not really internationalist. It's interventionist. And so we kind of careen back and forth between, okay, we're just going to have endless wars forever and ever, and apparently this, every other country that is not America, is none of our business. I'm not entirely sure that I dislike that idea in principle. In principle, it would be great to live in a world where we could just ignore everything that happened outside the United States and to only concentrate on ourselves and our people. From a principled viewpoint, that should be what the American government primarily does. Of course, the other changes that have occurred in the world is that manufacturing has largely moved out of the United States. We don't do manufacturing the way that we did, the way that won us World War II when we were a manufacturing giant in the world. And of course, in the immediate post-war world, since the manufacturing capacities of basically every other major country in the world had been bombed into rubble, we had this amazing industrial plant that we had built during World War II, and nobody else had any industry. So basically we were able to provide industry for the entire world, which we did for, well over a decade and a half. It wasn't until really the early 1960s that the rebuilt economies of Europe and Japan began to come back into their own. It took a long time to rebuild everything from being bombed into rubble. And that was a great time, but since that time, all this manufacturing has moved offshore. We import many of the goods that we no longer make here. Okay, so what that means is that we have a huge number of global trade routes that have to be guarded by somebody, and the post-World War II consensus was that it would be guarded by us, and that we would secure global trade in our own best interests to provide the military muscle that ensured that sea lanes were free and open. Nobody's worried about piracy in the post-World War era because the sea lanes were all patrolled largely by the United States Navy. That doesn't seem to be what America wants to do anymore. So our Navy is getting smaller. We're returning back to our shell. So I think the lesson that we learned from Iraq and Afghanistan is that, well, we just don't have the ability to impose our will just willy-nilly over every other country in the world. We don't seem to be able to figure out what our goals are for these endless wars so that we can declare victory and go home. And when we did finally just decide to go home, that turned out to be a disaster, although John Kirby over at the Pentagon says he's proud of that withdrawal. Okay, fine. We'll have to agree to disagree. So honestly, I don't know where this heads because of the American psyche going from we're all in on isolationism to we're all in on interventionism. Are we heading back to we're all in on isolationism? Okay, maybe. Certainly the Navy is getting smaller, and we are not extending American force along trade lanes with the same efficiency as we used to. Does this mean that trade routes are no longer going to be as well guarded? Does this mean that there may see some sort of resurgence of piracy? And in this case, I would expect piracy not to be like an independent guy that owns a ship like Captain Blackbeard, but state-sponsored piracy on the sea lanes. I don't know. I don't think that pure isolationism is wise. At the same time, the type of interventionism that we've seen since 9/11, where we just went completely crazy and overreacted to everything, I'm pretty sure that that's not the way to go either. But I don't know that we're capable of finding a happy middle on this. And by the way, I'm not the only one that's noticed this. Just to show you, there's a lot of people who are worried about this strain of isolationism coming in here in the United States. The Herald of Scotland: we should fear American isolationism as much as its imperialism. No, Ron DeSantis, this is from Massachusetts, the GOP doesn't need more isolationists. The Guardian, the world still needs a policeman. Let's hope the U.S. doesn't stop that job. And all of these other foreign press things just talking about isolationism and how bad it would be if the Americans returned to isolationism. It does worry our European allies. My response to our European allies would be, if you're that worried about it, then perhaps you should develop the military capability to project force yourselves. Because if we're not going to provide global security in the way that we did from 1945 until 2020, then somebody has to do it. And if you're worried about that, then you should probably step up to the plate and do it yourself. And perhaps the new internationalism is some sort of international agreement between countries that are willing to build naval forces of the appropriate size to provide adequate security for global trade routes. That's assuming that global trade remains viable in the future. So that's one thing that I wanted to cover tonight. The second thing I wanted to cover is this law that's going into effect in Washington. It is about transgender youth. Now, I looked into this, And what we've been told is that this law says the state of Washington can just come and take your children away if you don't support them in gender-affirming medical care. You don't go ahead and allow them to do gender-affirming medical care. In other words, chemical castration, hormones, and all of the other transitional medical procedures, which at their logical end will sterilize the child. I mean, that's just how it works. If you're a female and you want to transition to male, then, you're going to lose your genitals and your reproductive organs. And the same thing, if you're a male going to female, that's going to happen to you as well. You are now going to be sterile. You will never have children. You have completely foreclosed the possibility. Personally, I think that's a pretty dumb thing to do and a pretty dumb decision to make at 14, 15, 16. I don't think that you are fully aware of the consequences of that decision at such a young age. And by the way, we don't let you get your ears pierced by yourself if you're 16. We certainly don't let you drink. We don't let you own guns. There's a whole bunch of things that we don't let you do for very good and prudential reasons whenever you are not 18. So I think the idea of minors undergoing gender-affirming care is an extraordinarily bad idea. Even if I were to arguendo say that, okay, it's fine if you decide that you want to dress like the opposite sex, the sex that you say you feel you are, and pass yourself off as that, I would draw the line, if you're a minor, at any medical procedures at all. Because if it turns out that you are wrong about your feelings or you change your mind, you may have irreparably altered the course of your life without any recourse. So I think it's an extraordinarily bad idea to allow teenagers and children to make life-altering decisions like that. So many states are just making it flat out illegal for children to go through any sort of gender assignment medical procedures. And you know what? I'm perfectly fine with that. Now, look, if you're an adult, I could not give less of a shit what you do. I simply couldn't. And I never have. So if you're gay or you feel like, at 25 years old, it's time for you to transition to being a man/woman, whatever it is that you want to transition to, you know what? You knock yourself out. You're an adult. It's time for you to make your own decisions and to take responsibility for those decisions. And it's not my job. It's not the state's job to tell you what to do with your life when you are an adult. You're perfectly free to make whatever decisions you want, to live the life that you want to live, to love who you want to love. I just don't care. It's not my life. It doesn't affect me, so I don't care what you do. And by the way, this transgender thing has been going on a long, long time, and it's been going on pretty much out in the open. So, in 1973, my family took a vacation to Disney World. And we left Houston, Texas. We just got on I-10 and we drove east. And our first stop was in New Orleans, which was super fun. We got to go see the Superdome, which at the time was brand new. And also Disney World at the time was brand new. So we got to go see the dome. And then we went to Bourbon Street. And I was, of course, not allowed to go inside any of the establishments there at Bourbon Street because, obviously I was way underage. So we were out in the street. But as the barkers at the doors would open up, you could see what appeared to be ladies on the stage dancing inside these bars. And then they would ultimately reveal themselves to not be ladies at all. Okay, this is in New Orleans in 1973, And this was just part and parcel of the way New Orleans was. New Orleans has always been kind of a wild little town anyway, sort of tucked away deep into the Bible Belt, doing the things that their French heritage sort of inclined them to do. Nobody cared about it. I mean, that's just what it was, but it was all adults, all consenting adults. Nobody was holding a gun to your head to make you go watch the show. And that's the way that I feel towards pretty much all adult activities. For kids, it's a problem. So let's talk about this legislation. Now, the way it's been set off is that the state of Washington now, if you don't support your kid in getting transgender care, they will take your children away from you. Now, that's how it's being talked about all over the internet. But that is not exactly what the law says. I'm not saying that what the law says isn't bad enough, but it's not, the kid says, I want to be a woman, and the parent says, no, we're not going to go through with that. And then you call Child Protective Services, and armed agents of the state come in and whisk your children away from you without you being able to say anything. That's not what the bill says. What the bill does is it changes the shelter laws that the state has for runaways who show up at a shelter. Now, prior to this law, which is, I believe, still called Senate Bill 5599, prior to this law, the law in Washington specified that if you showed up as a runaway at a child shelter, parents were, with a couple of exceptions that are written into the law, parents were required to be notified by the shelter that their runaway child had showed up there. Now, there were a couple of exceptions to that, primarily abuse. So if a child shows up and says, I'm being sexually or physically abused by my father or mother or whatever, then the shelter did not have an obligation to tell your parents. That was an exception. What the new law does now is it increases those numbers of exceptions for specified medical procedures. So essentially, if you're a runaway and you show up at a Washington shelter for runaways, which apparently they have a number of, you can go to the shelter and say, look, I need an abortion. That's one of the medical procedures. Or I'm looking for gender reassignment surgery. I want to transition. That's one of the other protected procedures. And under this new law, the shelter no longer has an obligation to tell your parents that you've shown up at the shelter. And what this is being touted as by conservative people on the internet is this is the state coming and taking your children away. Well, not exactly, or at least not in the sense that the state is showing up at your house and pulling the kids out of your house at gunpoint. This really applies to the shelter system for the state of Washington and the exemptions from notifying parents that their runaway children have showed up there. So when you actually look at the law itself, it does appear to be rather less draconian than what we're being told that it says. Now, as a practical matter, if I show up at a shelter and the shelter says, well, I don't have an obligation to tell your parents because the state says I don't, and so we are going to presumably assist you and hook you up with the appropriate transitioning services or abortion services, because that's one of the other medical services that are covered under this new law. Then the state is acting, at least in that sense, in loco parentis by not notifying your parents of what's going on and jumping in and allowing you to perform any of these procedures that are covered under this law that you want to perform as a minor. I think that's an extraordinarily bad idea, But it's not a case of the state coming in and just saying, okay, well, your kid says they want to transition and you don't want to let them transition. So therefore, you're an awful human being. You're an unfit parent. We're just going to take your children away and do what we want with them. It's not what the law says. So, it's hard sometimes when you look at the internet and you see the way people characterize things, and then you actually go to the source material. And the source material, which in this case is not innocuous. I'm not saying this is a good law or one that I would support, but it doesn't have the sort of apocalyptic results that its detractors say it has. I think the idea that we have to give these kids this choice if they show up at a shelter and we have to support them in that choice, I think it's a fundamentally stupid idea. There was a guy on Twitter, and he's in Denmark. I don't remember his name, but he had this tweet that said, look, if my kid came to me and said, hey, I feel like I'm trans and I want to go ahead and transition to, if he was a boy, transition to being a woman. My job is to love them and to be supportive and to follow them as they follow their heart. No, that's not your job as a parent. Your job as a parent is not to follow your children. Your job as a parent is to lead your children, to protect your children, even if that means protecting them from the consequences of their own decisions, no matter how well they think they have thought those decisions out. The best way to protect children is to prevent them from making life-altering and irrevocable decisions that there's no do-overs for this. There's no takesies, backsies. Once you've done it, you've done it. And if you're doing it at 15, well, there is a percentage of people who are known as detransitioners, and you don't hear a lot about them because, I don't know, I guess they don't show up very high in the algorithms because they have stories about how they thought they needed to transition and they started to transition. And then when they got older, they really regretted it and they wanted to go back to what they were. But in many cases, of course, they can't. They'll never be able to have children, never have a family, because they have destroyed their own reproductive capability before they even reach the age of 18. And I think the job of a parent is to prevent your children from doing things like that. Again, once they're 18, they can do what they want. It's their life. You can't be a parent forever. And I know sometimes that for parents, you might feel like you're always a parent and that you always have this urge to intervene, but you can't. Once they're 18, they have to make their own decisions. They have to be independent and they have to learn about choice and consequence. Every decision that you make in your life has a consequence. And the life you're living today is largely the consequence of decisions that you've made in the past. And as much as you might want to, you can't protect your children, your adult children, from that. But your minor children, to the extent you can, you should. And all this talk about, the Republicans, the conservatives, whatever, they hate transgender people. They're making life hard for transgender people. No, nobody cared about transgender people until you started to bring kids into it. And when you start bringing kids into it, now people begin to care. I didn't care about transgender stuff until you started bringing children into it. Bringing children into the mix goes to a completely different level. Things that I am perfectly willing to tolerate and allow quite freely for adults, I'm not willing to see children subjected to that. And here's the really interesting thing, because it's framed in, these conservatives just hate gay and transgender subjects being taught in class. Yeah, that's true. You know what else they don't want to see in class? Traditional strippers on stripper poles. They don't want to see bikini contests in class. They don't want to see really any sort of inappropriate sexual activity, whether it's heterosexual or homosexual or transsexual. They just don't want their kids exposed to it. And they certainly don't want their kids exposed to it in school. You know what they would like their school to teach their children? How to read, how to write, and how to do arithmetic, which increasingly schools can't do. 40% of high school seniors graduate as functional illiterates from our public school system. So my suggestion would be that prior to getting into these social issues, you actually do your job and teach kids to read and write. After you've solved that problem and we are back to graduating high school students with a literacy rate of 100%, then we can talk about some of these other issues. We can talk about it, but you know what? I don't want you teaching that either. All I want you teaching school is academic subjects. These social subjects, that's just not the teacher's job. Now, granted, I know a lot of kids aren't getting the proper educational support at home. You know what? Don't know how to fix that. But again, if you can't teach kids how to read and write, you shouldn't be teaching kids all of these other diversity, equity, inclusion stuff. Treat everyone fairly, treat everyone with civility, treat everyone equally, and that's about the best that you can do. Anything beyond that is it goes beyond the remit of education, and you shouldn't be doing it. All right, so next thing up. I noticed this running on CNN Business. 4 out of the 5 U.S. metro areas with the lowest unemployment in the United States are in Florida. Well, that's interesting, and here's why. Everybody is moving to Florida. Indeed, David Brooks in the New York Times, he is their tame, quote-unquote, conservative commenter who came out on Twitter this week, and he said something to the effect of, a lot of pundits, quite properly, are talking about what a mess the GOP has become. However, why are so many people leaving New York and California and going to places like Florida and Texas? I don't know. It's a puzzler. It's a poser. And I think that all fits in sort of hand in hand with what we've been talking about. All of these culture war issues that our institutions are taking a side on. And diversity, equity, inclusion, the whole transgender things, our educational system, are certainly half of the politicians in this country have all jumped on this bandwagon. This is what they are pushing and supporting. And apparently people are getting a little tired of it. And so they're moving to states where this doesn't get pushed. I think it's interesting that they're moving to Florida because if you really want to pick the poster child or the poster boy for anti-woke stuff, I think you have to point out to Ron DeSantis as that person. I mean, he's definitely the anti-woke cheerleader as far as governors goes. And by the way, it does appear to be successful for him in Florida. I mean, he actually took a state that had a 300,000 plus Democratic registration lead into a state that now has a 200,000 plus Republican registration lead among the electorate. I mean, say what you want about Ron DeSantis, and a lot of the Trump people say a lot of things about him, usually negative, about what a horrible governor he is. But okay, if he's such a horrible governor, he has managed to turn Florida, what was at the very best a purple state and perhaps even trending to a blue state, he's managed to turn it red. I mean, he barely won the election, his first election as governor, by less than 1%. And he walked away with this election, and every single county in Florida trended more Republican than Democratic. So it appears that he's doing a fine job in Florida. And, you can say what you want about Ron DeSantis. And, I mean, here is a guy who has gone all in against abortion. He just signed the 6-week abortion ban. He's gone all in against sexual content in schools, all in against transgenderism, all in against DEI. And yet the Trump people say, see, he's just a globalist. Well, if he's a globalist, he doesn't appear to be listening to his globalist masters too much. And apparently, he is running a state that people want to go to. 137 million people visited the state last year, according to the state's marketing and tourism department. So Florida seems to be doing pretty well for itself, at least according to CNN. This coming to us from today, in fact, out of CNN. It's really interesting, though, because we don't know if Ron DeSantis is running for president in 24. I mean, we kind of think that he is. We suspect that he is. Donald Trump certainly believes that he is. But we don't actually know. And out of fear of Ron DeSantis, and by the way, that's the only thing it can be. It is fear. Donald Trump is, and his surrogates, Laura Loomer, Ed Bruesewitz, all of these people on social media and whatever, they're going all in on how horrible Ron DeSantis is. He's just a horrible person. The people of Florida don't appear to agree. The people who go to visit Florida don't appear to agree. And the people who are moving to Florida don't appear to agree. Donald Trump does. Let's say Ron DeSantis runs. Now, currently, the state of Florida law is that if he decides to declare his candidacy for the presidency, he has to resign as governor of Florida. So that's the law in Florida. My understanding is that the Florida legislature is looking at that law and wanting to eliminate or at least alter that law so that it's not quite as stringent as it is. But the current state of Florida law is Ron DeSantis, if he declares for president, has to resign as governor. So he's going to hold off, I think, for as long as he can. And why shouldn't he? It's still a year away, the first primaries. So there's no reason for him to declare his candidacy yet. Obviously, Donald Trump has, and Donald Trump is just savaging him every day, or his surrogates are savaging him every day, savaging DeSantis, I mean, on Trump's behalf. And I kind of wonder why Trump is so scared of DeSantis. Because Donald Trump has a built-in advantage in the GOP nomination. And it's one that's going to be hard for anybody, including DeSantis, to overcome. Which is that I would say out of the GOP electorate, there is probably a good 30 to 40% of GOPers who are all in 100% on the whole MAGA movement. They love Donald Trump. I see these memes all the time on social media showing Donald Trump, with Jesus bending over him and guiding his hands, and all of this horrific cult of personality stuff. And by the way, let's not mince words. Donald Trump has built, or at least has allowed to have built around him, a cult of personality. He knows it. I think he's a narcissist enough that he loves it and he encourages it, and he puts himself as, I'm the only person who can go to Washington, D.C. and clean it up. Why he wasn't able to clean it up in the first 4 years, well, I'll leave that to your imagination. But now he's really, really serious and he can clean it up. And look, 30 to 40% of Republicans just eat that up. In the primary process, the way the Democrats do things is, well, it's rigged, but at least for the primaries themselves, whenever the election night is over for the primary in whatever state, they divvy out the Democratic National Convention delegates for that state based on the proportion of the vote that each candidate gets. So if you have three candidates and one gets, 45% of the vote, then he gets 45% of the delegates, and then the other two get the appropriate percentage of the delegates at the convention. And what that means is that you can do badly in one state, but do well in other states. And because it is all the award of delegates is all proportional, that primary season can go on for quite a long time, and you have a better chance, A, of getting nominated, or B, at least having enough delegates that you become the power broker at the convention. Maybe you can't be president, but hey, do you want my delegates? I get to be vice president, because in 4 or 8 years, that means that I have a better shot at being president. Why you would think that, I'm not entirely sure. Americans have traditionally not elected vice presidents, certainly not sitting vice presidents, with the exception of George H.W. Bush. Sitting vice presidents have tended to do awfully. But the fact is, you think if you're vice president, you got a shot at the center seat. So, oh, and also, by the way, if you make me vice president, I mean, who knows? You could get hit by a truck and I could just magically become president instantly. And so it's an interesting system. Now, as I said, the way the Democrats do it, it's rigged. Because even if you do well in the primaries, the Democrats have this class of delegates called the superdelegates. And there's just enough of the superdelegates so that they can ensure that they all vote for the person that the party actually wants to run for president and to nominate. And so even if you do fairly well in the primaries, when you get to the convention, the superdelegates, of which I believe there are around 1,500 or so, they can all just swoop down and say, hey, we pick Hillary, which, by the way, is what happened in 2016. Hillary just had all of the superdelegates locked up, and everybody knew it. And so that entire primary was more or less an attempt to crown Hillary queen. Didn't work out exactly the way that they expected on election night. But anyway, that's the Democrats, the way they do it. The Republicans do it differently, and this is what gives Donald Trump an advantage. On the Republican side, if you win the state's primary, you win the state's delegates. So in most states, I don't believe all, but in most states, the way the Republicans had this thing set up is a winner-takes-all system. So if you aren't the number one person in a state, you get nothing. Good day, sir. You lose. And if you win, then you get everything. So this winner-takes-all system is really weighted in this particular case in Donald Trump's favor. Because if you have, let's say you have a field of like 10 candidates, and you, as Donald Trump, know that you are walking into that state with a 30 to 35% definite vote out of 10 candidates. You've got an excellent chance of winning that primary. Because out of the remaining 9 candidates, asking one of them to get 36% is a big ask. What's probably more likely is that out of the 10 candidates, one gets 20%, one gets 10, then 5, 3, 2, whatever. And so you have somebody who does well, but he doesn't get 28% of the delegates. He just loses. He's a loser, and you become the winner, and you get to go to the next state and try winning again. Because Donald Trump has this hardcore following among voters who are the most committed to Donald Trump, which we will take as a proxy for being the most interested in voting in a primary, the chances are that this gives Donald Trump a leg up in pretty much every important Republican primary, especially those that have a lot of delegates. So I think at this point, it's undeniable. Well, he's the only one running, of course, at this point. Well, there's that other guy, Vivek Ramaswamy, who doesn't have a chance. Nobody knows who he is. And a couple of others who have declared they're going nowhere. It's Donald Trump who is the front runner. And I don't know. Maybe next year, if Ron DeSantis decides, well, let's see. Maybe next year, after the Florida legislature says the governor doesn't have to resign if he's running for president, and they alter that law, and then he decides to jump in, then we'll see what that polling looks like. But I don't even think First of all, the polls that we see, well, Trump leads, Biden, or Trump loses to Biden by 3%, and DeSantis wins against Biden by 4%. But in the primaries, Trump is ahead of DeSantis, 56 to 25, or whatever those numbers are. It's useless. This is 2023. Nothing is going to happen for another 8 months. So nothing that happens now matters. But we'll see in 8 months how this works out. But right now, Donald Trump has what I think is a commanding lead, and it's going to be a hard lead for the DeSantis team to beat. Okay, so next topic. Yes, I actually did show prep for this. And by the way, I always forget, am I showing the screen or am I showing me? I always forget. I think I do want to show the screen though at this point. The U.S. government is really getting interested in a digital dollar. And I think for a couple of reasons. First of all, let's turn that little thing off. First of all, the U.S. dollar is not yet in trouble. And we've talked about this a lot. Michael and I have had this discussion over and over. So we know all about how the dollar is under pressure. But this new BRICS group, who have decided not to use the dollar in foreign exchange and to use their currencies, that reduces the reliance on the dollar as the primary currency used in international trade. If this trend continues, and by the way, we're doing everything we can in this country to make it continue. We're running trillion-dollar deficits now. We're $31 trillion in debt. And, well, with running a $1 trillion deficit every year, that's going to soon become $32 trillion, 33, and so forth. That amount of debt, which, by the way, I'm not entirely sure how we're going to pay all of that back, but that amount of debt weighs down on the dollar. It makes it less valuable, ultimately, even in the Forex market. The dollar has lost, since the Fed took over management of the dollar, 95% of its value. So in the last 100 years, because that's about when the Fed was created, in the last 100 years, 95% of the dollar's value has just been frittered away. The dollar is worth whatever the Fed says it's worth right now. Back when I was a kid, you could still get dollars, and you could look at the little seal on the dollar. I don't know if you look at a dollar and you look at like the Treasury seal and you look at the color of the text. The color of the text is now green and the Treasury seal is just done in black. But go back about 70 years and take a look at what a US dollar looked like. And the US dollar did not say, legal tender, valid for all debts, public and private. What it said was, and the seal, the Treasury seal on it was blue, as were the numbers. And there was also another version of it that was very similar, but I forget the color. I think maybe it was red, dark red, or maroon. In any event, it's the blue bills that I was talking about. And it said, the Treasury of the United States will pay to the bearer $1. What that dollar was is a gold certificate. There was another type of dollar. It was a silver certificate. So you had gold certificate dollars and silver certificate dollars. And when it said, like the most common was the silver certificate, right? So when it said the United States Treasury will pay the bearer $1, you could tritty-trot into the bank with that dollar and you could hand it down at the counter, and you could certainly do it in any of the Federal Reserve banks. Maybe not your local, First State Bank, but certainly if you went into any of one of the 12 Federal Reserve banks and you tritty-trotted up to the counter and you gave them your dollar and said, I want my money. Well, what they would do is they would go in the back and they would take a little, glassine envelope and they would put $1 worth of pure silver dust in it. And they would come back and they would give you your little bag of silver. And you had been paid your $1. The paper dollars that you carried around in your pocket prior to 1973, that was when Richard Nixon just basically took us off the gold standard. But the little dollars that you carried around in your pocket were actually receipts for your money. Your money was actually stored in the form of silver in most cases, gold in others, at the United States Treasury, primarily in the U.S. Depository at Fort Knox, but also in other places like the Federal Reserve Bank of Manhattan and so forth. In fact, all of the Federal Reserve banks had some readily accessible stash of gold and silver that they could pay you. And so that money, as I said, was those dollar bills were a receipt for your money. And those dollar bills were worth the weight of that money, the weight of silver, the weight of gold, which meant that they were worth whatever silver and gold was worth at that time. And over time, of course, gold, silver, they tend to hold their purchasing power value. And so there's nothing usually dramatic about silver and gold prices. Oh, there are occasional spikes up and down there. They can be volatile at times. But if you look over the long term, the price of silver and gold largely tracks the inflation rate that we're used to seeing with dollars. Now, what that meant, because those dollars were a receipt for actual money, was that you could go home and you could pick up your mattress and you could just start storing cash under your mattress, which, by the way, was something that many people did. You know, especially after the 1930s when so many banks failed, taking people's life savings with them. You know, there are a lot of people of the Depression generation who just decided they didn't trust banks anymore, and they would just hold their cash and they would store it. And you know what? That was fine, because you could always go back and get gold and silver for that money, or for those receipts. You could always get the actual money that backed those gold or silver dollars. But since 1973, we haven't been on the gold standard. So therefore, the money no longer says the United States government will pay to the bearer $1. What it says is this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. The dollar bills that you carry around in your pocket right now are a receipt for nothing. The dollar is worth whatever the Fed says it is worth via its policy machinations, whatever it happens to do. So therefore, we see this huge slump in the value of the dollar, especially since 1973. The second that we went off of the dollar, I don't know if you remember the horrible inflation of the 1970s, but it was pretty bad, as we've talked about before, with 30-year mortgage rates approaching 18%. It was bad. So now the Fed just controls this money that is worthless. It's literally a piece of paper. And the only thing that makes it work, the only thing that allows us to use it as money, is not its intrinsic value, it has none, is not the money it represents, because it doesn't represent any. It is this promise that it's actual money. It's this belief that if I give you this piece of paper, you will give me something that is worth the face value of that piece of paper. It's called a fiat currency. All of its transactions are based on faith in this specific currency. And that's the only thing that backs it. As a result, and because so many dollars are floating around in foreign countries for use in international settlements, if that money all floats back over here, then, well, we've printed so much of it. There is so much of it in existence, which, by the way, is something you can do when you have a fiat currency, because I don't have to have the 1/16th of an ounce of silver or 1/36th of an ounce of gold sitting in a depository vault for every dollar bill that's in circulation. I don't have to have anything. So therefore, I can print as many dollars as I want. Ultimately, when you print as many dollars as you want, if those dollars all come back home, we'll have massive inflation. Too many dollars chasing too few goods in the United States. And so, if that collapses, the big idea, and certainly some have called it a conspiracy theory, but I think it's probably based on the Treasury's interest in this. The idea is probably to replace it with a digital currency. Like the idea that, okay, well, if our currency collapses, we'll be able to make a digital dollar and all of the old problems will just be washed away and this new currency will save us all. Except for two problems. The first problem is the way Bitcoin works. The way Bitcoin works is you know what the supply of Bitcoin is. Bitcoins can only be mined at a specific rate. So the growth of Bitcoin is largely constrained by this rate of growth that is built into the algorithm that makes Bitcoin. So yes, I can have more Bitcoin ultimately, but the demand for Bitcoin may be higher or lower than the actual rate of expansion of that currency because it's rigidly controlled. And so with Bitcoin, because I can't control the rate at which it is created and which a new supply of money enters the economy, I can't dilute it. I can't make it worthless. I can't debase that currency because I don't have control over its rate of creation. Speaking now, as a government actor. So, okay, fine. However, the problem is, and I think it's mentioned in here in the article, a central bank issued currency is not like Bitcoin, where it is decentralized, so nobody really has control over it anyway, so nobody can really mess it up. Its rate of creation is baked into the algorithm that creates Bitcoin, so nobody can mess with it. Nobody can own it. It's an independent currency. Is it a currency? I don't know. Let's not have that argument here. The thing is that because it's decentralized, it's not controlled. And also because it's decentralized and the method by which it is made, it can't be debased. And because it is decentralized, if I have Bitcoin, you can't really track my purchases via Bitcoin. A central bank digital currency won't work that way, and therefore will be ultimately doomed to fail. Because number one, it will be centralized. The central bank will control the value of that currency. That means that if they decide to debase it, then they could certainly debase it all they wanted, and we'd end up in the same situation that we are slowly marching our way towards with our fiat paper dollars. Even worse is that it won't be permissionless, which means that it gives the government the ability to track every purchase that we make. The one advantage cash has, and by the way, we talked about it at least tangentially last week when we talked about when you're paying your whore money to shut up, you don't pay them by check, you pay them by cash. You don't pull a Jerry Springer, you give them cash because cash is untraceable. That is the value of having it. It's always good to have some cash on hand if you want to make purchases that you don't want tracked. This is why people don't give you their MasterCard when they're buying cocaine, because cash is untraceable. A central bank digital currency will not be untraceable. They'll be able to oversee everything that you do with that currency. And by the way, this last year, with the Canadian truckers' protest, we saw the Canadian government actually went in, found out who they were, and shut down their bank accounts. It would be trivially simple for the federal government just to exempt you from ever spending any of these digital dollars if they didn't like what you said or what you thought, or they thought you were some sort of domestic terrorist, which the way that the Department of Homeland Security categorizes that can just mean you don't like cats, as far as I can tell. The government can shut you down. And so it's extraordinarily dangerous giving the government that power. So as the Foundation for Economic Education says, the downsides of that are bordering on dystopian. It just gives the government complete control over your life. A government that says we want to get rid of cash and replace it with digital currency is a government that is essentially saying we want to control all of your purchases and we want to be able to track every single thing you do. All right, so with that in mind, let's talk about electricity and electric cars, because the Biden administration has just said we want to ensure that by 2032, let's count, 2023, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32. That's 10. 10 years. In 10 years, 2/3 of all cars and 1/4 of all heavy trucks will have to be all electric vehicles. In 10 years. What if I want to drive across country with my heavy truck? Well, good luck with that, because the current state of play, and I'm not saying that in 10 years it won't be better, but the current state of play is I'm going to be able to drive that truck carrying, 10,000 pounds of goods, whatever it is that, I don't even know how much 18-wheelers carry, honestly, but let's say, 5 tons. It's probably closer to 10 tons, but whatever. Let's say 10 tons. So I'm carrying 10 tons. I'll probably be able to travel 250 miles pulling 10 tons worth of goods. Then I got to stop. Then I got to recharge things. And it's probably going to take 5 or 6 hours to do that recharge. Okay, so let's say it takes me 5 or 6 hours to go 250 miles. And, well, let's be charitable. Let's say 4 hours to go 250 miles. And then I've got to recharge for 4, 5, 6 hours. So let's say 4 hours. Okay, well, that's 8 hours. So 8 hours to go 250 to 300 miles. Okay, so if I wanted to drive from California to Florida, a distance of about 3,600 miles, can we do the math on how long that would take? Also, keep in mind, you have these rest hours and these uninterrupted rest hours that you're supposed to take as a long-haul trucker. So basically, for a 3,600-mile journey where I can only travel 300 miles every 8 hours, that's going to take me about a month or at least 2 weeks, probably 3, to get from California to, let's say, Hollywood, Florida. That's a long time. In fact, that's longer times than we have had to wait for shipments to get all the way across the country since probably the 19-teens to the 1920s. So that's not good. And here's the other thing that is not good. California has decided to go even further. So 2032, 10 years from now, the federal government wants 2/3 of all cars and 1/4 of all heavy trucks to be zero-emission vehicles, basically electric vehicles. The government has decided that electric is the way to go, which, by the way, is by no means certain. It's by no means certain that that is actually the technology that we want to pursue, because there are still the hydrogen fuel cell things. There are a couple of other ideas that are being floated around for zero emissions vehicles that would be a lot less troublesome in terms of transportation and recharge times than battery-powered electric vehicles currently are. But that's a conversation we can have another time. California has decided that by 2035, it's 100%. So now we're not 10 years, but 13 years from now, every single car sold in California has to be a zero emissions vehicle of some type. Okay. And it says, by the way, this is a first in nation zero emissions vehicle regulation that will clean the air. We'll talk about that. / climate pollution. Sure it will. And this is the big one. And save consumers money. Oh, really? So let's take these three claims and look at them. The first two, I think we can dispense with right off the top. Clean the air and / climate pollution. Really? It'll clean the air and / climate pollution. And how do you suppose it's going to do that? First of all, people have to charge those vehicles. How are those vehicles going to be charged? If you're not going to build nuclear power plants, and California is not going to do that. If you're not going to build nuclear power plants, how are they going to be powered? Because, well, you could build more wind farms. How many condors do you want to kill with your wind farms? Okay, you could build solar farms. And how many species are you going to destroy by building a solar farm? I mean, technically, it would be possible to meet all of California's energy requirements with solar if you had a solar farm whose solar mirrors alone were a land area the size of Los Angeles County. To actually make that solar farm, and with the space between the mirrors and all of that, you'd actually need a land area 3 times the size of Los Angeles County. Okay, how many species are you going to deprive of habitat by building that solar farm that's 3 times the size of Los Angeles? Obviously, you're not going to build it all in one place. It's going to be scattered all over the state, but that's still the type of land area we are talking about. And what happens if it rains, as it has here in San Diego for this past week? It's been raining off and on for, a couple of weeks out here. How much solar are you going to be producing there? And by the way, as you're building these solar mirrors and whatnot, how about the environmental degradation that goes hand in hand with the production of these solar mirrors or the production of wind turbines? Because after all, steel and aluminum and other things have to be smelted, and you're not powering that with electricity. And they all have to be built. They all have to be installed. Solar panels, of course, take many caustic chemicals that have to be dealt with. Let's look at the cars themselves. These batteries don't last forever. Those have to be gotten rid of because they only have a certain number of charge cycles built into them. I mean, right now, the top battery that we have is lithium ion. Well, what are you going to do with all of that lithium that comes out of those batteries every time you have to replace them? And which, by the way, they do have to be replaced every 5 years or so under normal driving conditions. You have run through the number of charges that those batteries have. That whole battery pack has to be pulled out and replaced. That's not cheap. That will cost thousands and thousands of dollars, almost the equivalent of buying a new car. So you're going to save money, and you're going to slash climate pollution with all of the heavy metals that are going to be required to build wind and solar. Let's say that you are going to go with wind and solar. Assuming that you don't care enough about the environment to just wipe out habitat after habitat by having these massive wind and solar farms providing the energy. And by the way, California's had all kinds of great ideas about solar farms. They've built one out here in the desert, not too far away from where I am, which has never produced a watt of electricity. Millions of dollars into this pilot plant for producing solar power, and basically it's just been abandoned. Now, it will never produce a single watt of power that makes it to the electrical grid. It still takes up a couple of football fields in the middle of the desert. but it doesn't do anything. So how are we going to fill up these cars? By the way, the number of power outages in California, and this doesn't just include natural disasters. These means power outages because we didn't have enough generating power and power had to be shut off to do rolling blackouts or brownouts. Last year, the number of power outages in California went from 20,000 all across the state to 26,000. We can't even provide reliable power with 100% reliability, certainly not in the summer because we do have rolling blackouts. We came very close last year to having a number of rolling blackouts. We kind of skipped over it. We were able to buy power from other states and pull power generation from other places. But it's at the point now where if we have a hot day, there is a very real possibility that the California ISO, the independent system operator that runs the power grid, Cal ISO might just say, you don't get power for 2 hours because we can't meet energy demand. Okay, if we can't meet energy demand in a state with 41 million people with approximately 70 million cars on the road, actually, I don't think it's 70, I think it's closer to 60. But 41 million people, 60 million cars more or less on the road. How am I going to power those 60 million cars? Where's the electrical power generation going to come from? Are we literally going to build solar and wind farms that take up hundreds of square miles of habitat? Because you can't build them in cities, you have to build them out in the middle of nowhere, which means going after habitat. Now, sure, I guess you could argue that there aren't that many animals that can live out in Death Valley. Okay, great. But now you've got to be able to send people out there. You've got to build these things in the middle of nowhere, and then you've got to build the transmission capability to get them into the regular power grid. Well, good luck with that. That certainly is not slashing climate pollution. I'm not certain how it's cleaning the air. I mean, there won't be emissions from gasoline-powered vehicles. But what about any of the emissions? Because if we can't generate the power, what are we going to do? They're discovering this in Germany. Well, we've shut down our nuclear power plants. How are we going to generate power? Well, I guess we're back to coal. And so they're burning coal. And German coal is that horrible lignite coal, which is about the worst in the world when it comes to pollution. By the way, one of the reasons why the Imperial German Navy could never get very far, because their coal would gunk up, because it's soft lignite coal, it would gunk up all of their boilers on their Navy ships. That's the same stuff that they have to burn today to try to generate power. It's bad, gunky coal with lots of particulate matter that goes into the atmosphere. Are we going to have to go back to that to try to get these cars charged? Because right now, as far as I can tell, there is no plan that is reliable for increasing California's electricity generation. And if we're having rolling blackouts now without electric cars, what is that situation going to look like? Indeed, last August, Cal ISO specifically asked people not to charge your electric cars. You know, we're getting really, really close to our limit. If you charge your electric cars, you may push us over. Okay, so now you're mandating that I buy an electric car, ultimately. But if power gets a little too low, well, too bad. I guess you can't go anywhere. You can't drive your car. And by the way, I'm not the only one that is noticed this. Various newspapers across the state are putting it out as well. If you can't even power the state, how can you go ahead and have a electric truck mandate, an electric vehicle mandate, and all of that other stuff that will mandate that we have to have electric vehicles? We don't have a power grid that will handle that. We can't take the expanded load off of our current power grid. We can barely meet our current demand with no electric vehicles. So how do you expect it to work? Well, I don't know. Maybe they don't expect it to work. You know, I have said this many times. I generally tend to think that what you have with government is this mix of just, basically, it's just incompetence. Generally, never explained by conspiracy what can be explained with incompetence. But there does come a point where the incompetence is so severe and so constant and defies reason. So this electric vehicle mandate defies reason, certainly does here in California, but in a larger sense in the United States overall, it defies reason. We know we don't have, and by the way, California is not the only state where electrical power generation is very close to peak and where it's very difficult to build more power generating capacity. In fact, in most states, it's very difficult to build power generation capacity, largely because the EPA can hold you up for years and years on any sort of power plant. Not saying that happens all the time, but it is one of the big hurdles that you have to get across, the environmental assessments and whatnot that the EPA requires. So if we can't build quickly a lot of generating capacity, then we're not going to be able to drive these cars. I mean, it's obvious. If you say I'm going to mandate electric vehicles, then at the same time, you have to mandate the ability to power those electric vehicles. Is this an oversight? Well, if it is, it's the type of oversight that is so specific and so inexplicable that at some point you have to begin to ask the question, is this incompetence or is it malevolence? And I'm getting awfully close to the idea of thinking that what we're seeing is, well, I say awfully close. Look, I'm already at that point. I don't think that most of what we're seeing with these government policies is incompetent. Yes, a lot of people in government are dumb. After all, government jobs are great. The lower third, the bottom third of your high school graduating class should have some sort of career. But at some point, incompetence becomes malevolence. And that's a point I think we've passed. In any event, that's all I got for you tonight. Have a great night. Hope to see you again next week. Michael should be back next week, and we should have a full-on podcast. Hope to see you then. In the meantime, have a great week. So long.